The snow had claimed another life today. Or so Nathaniel Zimmerman believed when she collapsed face first into the frozen earth just 50 yards from where Thomas Reed sat warming his hands by a fire outside his cabin in the Montana wilderness. Thomas had been watching the horizon for the better part of an hour, something he did most evenings since settling in this desolate stretch of land, 20 miles south of Quartz Hill. The year was 1878, and winter had come early and harsh, blanketing everything in white and turning the trails into death traps for anyone foolish enough to travel alone. He spotted the figure stumbling through the snow when the sun was just beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the endless white expanse. At first, he thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but as the shape drew closer, he realized with a jolt that it was a person, and they were moving with the jerky, uncoordinated movements of someone at the very edge of their endurance. Thomas stood immediately, his tall frame unfolding as he grabbed his coat and started moving toward the figure. He was 26 years old, weathered by years of cattle drives and harsh seasons, his face angular and marked by a scar along his left cheek from a bronco that had nearly killed him 3 years prior. His dark hair fell past his collar, and his eyes were the color of creek water in summer, gray-green and constantly assessing. He had learned long ago that hesitation could mean death out here, so he moved quickly, his boots crunching through the crusty top layer of snow as he ran. When he reached the collapsed figure, he dropped to his knees and carefully turned the person over, surprised to find a young woman staring up at him with glassy, unfocused eyes. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as the snow around them, and her breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps. She wore a threadbare coat that looked like it had seen better days a decade ago, and her hands were bare, the fingers an alarming shade of purple-white. "Can you hear me?" Thomas asked, his voice urgent but steady. "Can you tell me your name?" The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes tried to focus on his face but kept sliding away, as though even that small effort was too much. Thomas did not waste any more time with questions. He could see she was on the verge of freezing to death, and out here in the open, she would not last another hour. He slipped one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her with a grunt of effort. She weighed almost nothing, which concerned him even more than her condition. How long had she been traveling? Where had she come from? "I will carry you," he said, though he was not sure she could hear him. "I will get you somewhere warm." He started back toward his cabin, moving as quickly as he could while being careful not to jostle her too much. The distance that had taken him less than a minute to cover at a run now seemed impossibly long as he struggled through the snow with her dead weight in his arms. His muscles burned with the effort, but he kept moving, focusing on the warm glow of his fire in the distance. When he finally reached the cabin, he kicked the door open and carried her inside, laying her carefully on his bed, which sat in the corner near the stone fireplace. The cabin was small but well built, with thick log walls and a sturdy roof that Thomas had spent weeks repairing when he first arrived. It consisted of a single room with his bed, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a fireplace, and shelves lined with supplies. Pelts and blankets hung on the walls for extra insulation, and his few possessions were stored in a trunk at the foot of the bed. It was not much, but it was warm and dry, which was all that mattered right now. Thomas immediately set to work building up the fire, adding several logs until the flames roared and heat began to fill the small space. Then he turned his attention to the woman, carefully removing her wet coat and boots. Her dress underneath was damp with melted snow and sweat, and he knew he needed to get her into dry clothes. He hesitated for a moment, aware of propriety, but survival took precedence. He retrieved one of his own shirts and a pair of woolen long underwear from his trunk, then carefully and respectfully changed her clothing, averting his eyes as much as possible while ensuring she was covered and warm. Once she was dressed in dry clothes, he piled every blanket he owned on top of her, then filled his tin kettle with water from the barrel near the door and set it to heat over the fire. He had some dried herbs that an old Crow woman had traded him last summer, claiming they were good for ailments of all kinds. He did not know if they would help, but he added them to the water anyway, along with a bit of honey from his dwindling supply. For the next several hours, Thomas sat beside the bed, watching the woman's face for any sign of improvement. He managed to get some of the warm herbal tea into her, dribbling it carefully into her mouth and making sure she swallowed. Her breathing gradually became less labored, and some color began to return to her cheeks, though she remained unconscious. He checked her hands and feet repeatedly, rubbing them gently to encourage circulation, relieved when they began to pink up and look less like the hands of a corpse. It was well past midnight when she finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering before slowly opening. Thomas, who had been dozing in his chair by the fire, immediately came alert. He moved closer to the bed, watching as her eyes moved around the unfamiliar room before finally settling on his face. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice rough and barely audible. "My cabin, about 20 miles south of Quartz Hill, Montana," Thomas said. "I found you collapsed in the snow. You have been unconscious for hours. What is your name?" The woman closed her eyes for a moment as though gathering strength. "Nathaniel," she said finally. "Nathaniel Zimmerman. Everyone calls me Natty." "Thomas Reid," he replied. "You can call me Thomas. Can you tell me what happened? Where were you traveling from?" Natty's face tightened with emotion, and for a moment Thomas thought she might cry, but she took a shaky breath and met his eyes. "Fort Benton. I was trying to reach Quartz Hill. I have an aunt there, at least I hope I still do. I have not heard from her in over a year." "Fort Benton is over 100 miles from here," Thomas said, unable to keep the shock from his voice. "You traveled that far alone? In winter?" "I did not have a choice," Natty said, and now tears did slide down her cheeks. "My father died 3 months ago, pneumonia. My mother passed when I was 12, so it was just the two of us. After he died, the landlord gave me a week to settle the debts or vacate. I had nothing. I sold everything we owned just to buy enough supplies to make the journey to my aunt's. She is the only family I have left." Thomas felt a surge of anger at the injustice of it, though he knew such things were all too common. He had seen plenty of people left destitute by circumstances beyond their control, cast out with nowhere to go and no one to help them. "You are safe here," he said firmly. "You need to rest and recover your strength. It is too dangerous to travel right now anyway. The snow is getting worse." "I cannot stay here," Natty protested weakly. "I have already imposed on you enough. I should continue on to Quartz Hill as soon as possible." "You will do no such thing," Thomas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "In your condition, you would not make it a mile. Besides, there is a storm coming. I can feel it in the air. You will stay here until you are well and until it is safe to travel. That is final." Natty looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. Her eyes drifted closed, and within moments she was asleep again. Thomas sat back in his chair, studying her face in the firelight. She was probably around 20 or 21, with delicate features and long dark hair that fanned across his pillow. Even in her weakened state, there was something striking about her, a quiet strength that he recognized because he had needed to cultivate the same quality in himself over the years. The storm Thomas had predicted arrived the next morning with a vengeance, howling around the cabin and piling snow against the walls, until it was nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Thomas was grateful he had stocked up on firewood and supplies before winter set in, because it quickly became clear they would be trapped inside for several days at least. Natty remained weak, sleeping most of the time and waking only to accept small amounts of food and water. Thomas made her broth from dried venison and the last of his root vegetables, patiently feeding it to her when she did not have the strength to hold the spoon herself. He found himself studying her face during these quiet moments, wondering about her life before tragedy had brought her to his doorstep. What kind of person traveled over 100 miles alone in the dead of winter? Someone desperate, certainly, but also someone brave and determined. On the third day of the storm, Natty woke with clearer eyes and more strength than she had shown since her arrival. She managed to sit up in bed, looking around the cabin with obvious curiosity. "Have I been sleeping in your bed this whole time?" she asked, a flush coloring her cheeks. "Where have you been sleeping?" "In the chair," Thomas said, nodding toward the wooden chair by the fire, which he had pulled close enough to the bed that he could reach her quickly if needed. "That cannot be comfortable," Natty said, her expression troubled. "You should take your bed back." "I can sleep on the floor or in the chair." "Absolutely not," Thomas said firmly. "You need proper rest to recover. The chair is fine. I have slept in far worse places, believe me." Natty looked like she wanted to argue, but instead she said, "Thank you for everything. I do not know how to repay you for saving my life." "No payment necessary," Thomas said. "Anyone would have done the same." "I do not think that is true," Natty said softly, "but it is kind of you to say so." As the days passed and Natty grew stronger, she began to insist on helping around the cabin despite Thomas's protests. She started small, mending his clothes and tidying up, then gradually took over the cooking, which Thomas had to admit was a significant improvement over his own rough efforts. She moved carefully around the small space, always conscious of not being in his way, and Thomas found himself increasingly aware of her presence in ways that had nothing to do with her status as an invalid. He would catch himself watching her as she worked, noting the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating, or the small smile that crossed her face when she managed to coax the temperamental stove into producing a decent meal. She had a quiet way about her, not shy exactly, but thoughtful, as though she weighed every word before speaking. When she did talk, her observations were often surprisingly insightful, and Thomas found himself engaging in conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. One evening, about a week after her arrival, they sat by the fire after supper, Natty wrapped in blankets in the chair while Thomas sat on the floor with his back against the wall. The storm had finally broken that afternoon, leaving behind a landscape transformed into a glittering wonderland of snow and ice. "Tell me about yourself," Natty said suddenly. "You know my story, but I know nothing about you except that you live alone in the middle of nowhere and you are kind to strangers." Thomas was quiet for a moment, not used to talking about himself. "Not much to tell," he said finally. "I grew up in Texas, worked cattle drives for several years, then decided I wanted something different. I came north about 3 years ago, did some trapping, some prospecting, odd jobs here and there. Built this cabin 2 years ago and I have been here ever since." "No family?" Natty asked gently. "Not anymore," Thomas said. "My parents died when I was 17, cholera. I had 2 older brothers, but one was killed in the war and the other headed west to California years ago. I have not heard from him in a long time." "I am sorry," Natty said. "It seems we have both lost more than we should have." "That is the way of things out here," Thomas said. "The land does not care about fair or unfair, it just is." "Do you like living alone?" Natty asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. I am sorry, that is too personal a question. It is all right, Thomas said. And I suppose the answer is that I got used to it. It is peaceful, being out here away from towns and people and all the complications they bring. But I would be lying if I said I did not get lonely sometimes. Natty nodded slowly. I understand that. After my mother died, it was just my father and me for 8 years. He was a good man, a printer by trade, and he taught me to read and write and figure. But he was quiet, not much for conversation. Sometimes days would go by where we barely spoke more than a dozen words to each other. I loved him, but I used to dream about having someone to really talk to, someone who understood what I was thinking without me having to explain everything. You must miss him, Thomas said. Every day, Natty admitted. But I also feel guilty because part of me feels freer now than I ever did before. Is that terrible? No, Thomas said. It is honest. Freedom and grief can exist together. They fell into comfortable silence after that, and Thomas found himself thinking about how natural it felt to have her there, how the cabin seemed less empty with her presence. He tried to tell himself it was just because he was not used to company, that any person would have the same effect, but he knew that was not entirely true. There was something about Natty specifically that drew him, a sense of recognition, as though he had been waiting for her without knowing it. The following day, Thomas announced that he needed to check his traps and gather more firewood, tasks he had been putting off because of the storm and his concern about leaving Natty alone. She assured him she was well enough to manage by herself for a few hours, and though he was reluctant, he knew he could not put off the work any longer. He set out in the clear, cold morning, following his trap line through the snow-covered forest. His mind kept drifting back to the cabin and its temporary occupant, wondering what she was doing, if she was truly all right on her own. He had never been the kind of man who worried excessively, but something about Natty brought out protective instincts he had not known he possessed. When he returned several hours later with 2 rabbits and a small load of firewood, he found Natty had been busy. She had washed all the bedding and hung it to dry near the fire, scrubbed the table and floor, and was in the process of making bread from his stores of flour and dried yeast. She looked up when he entered, her face flushed from the heat of the stove, and smiled. I hope you do not mind, she said. I needed to feel useful. I do not mind at all, Thomas said, surprised by how pleased he was to return to this scene of domestic activity. Though you should not have done so much, you are still recovering. I feel much better, Natty assured him. Honestly, you saved my life, Thomas. The least I can do is make sure you have clean bedding and decent bread. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Thomas tended to the outdoor work, checking traps, hunting, gathering wood, and maintaining the cabin's exterior. Natty took over most of the indoor tasks, cooking, cleaning, and mending, but also began helping Thomas process the pelts from his catches, a skill she picked up quickly despite never having done it before. They talked constantly, sharing stories about their pasts, their dreams, their thoughts on everything from the best way to cure venison to whether people were fundamentally good or bad. Thomas found himself laughing more than he had in years, charmed by Natty's dry sense of humor and quick wit. She had a way of finding absurdity in situations that would have made most people despair, and her resilience amazed him. One evening in early February, nearly a month after Natty's arrival, Thomas came in from an afternoon of hunting to find her standing by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with a troubled expression. "What is wrong?" he asked, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. Natty turned to him, and he saw that her eyes were red, as though she had been crying. "I need to continue on to Quartz Hill," she said. The weather has been clear for over a week now. I cannot keep imposing on your hospitality forever." Thomas felt as though someone had punched him in the chest. He had known this moment was coming, had tried to prepare himself for it, but the reality of her leaving hit him harder than he had expected. "You are not imposing," he said carefully. "You are welcome to stay as long as you want." "But I cannot," Natty said, her voice breaking. "Do you not see? I have no money, no prospects, nothing to offer. I am living on your charity, eating your food, burning your firewood. My aunt in Quartz Hill is my only hope of having any kind of future. I have to find her, have to see if she can take me in or at least help me find work. What if she is not there?" Thomas asked. "What if she moved, or worse? You said yourself you have not heard from her in over a year." "Then I will figure something out," Natty said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I have to try, Thomas. I cannot just stay here indefinitely, living off your kindness. It is not right." Thomas crossed the room to stand in front of her, his heart pounding. "What if I do not want you to leave?" he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "What if I asked you to stay, not as charity but as something else?" Natty stared at him, her eyes wide. "Thomas, what are you saying?" He took a deep breath, knowing he was about to risk everything but unable to stop himself. "I am saying that this last month has been the best of my life. I am saying that I look forward to seeing you every morning and hate the thought of coming home to an empty cabin again. I am saying that I care about you, Natty, far more than I probably should given how short a time we have known each other." Tears spilled down Natty's cheeks. "I care about you too," she whispered. "So much that it scares me, but I cannot stay here without any kind of understanding between us. People would talk. It would ruin both our reputations." "Then marry me," Thomas said, and was as shocked as she looked by the words. But once they were out, he knew they were right. "I know it is fast, and I know I do not have much to offer. But I promise I will work every day to build us a good life. I will protect you and provide for you. I will never let you face hardship alone again." "Thomas," Natty breathed, fresh tears flowing. "You cannot mean that. You barely know me." "I know enough," Thomas said firmly. "I know you are brave and strong and kind. I know you make me laugh and make me think. I know that when I am with you, the loneliness I have lived with for years disappears. I know that I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. That is enough for me. The question is whether it is enough for you." Natty was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas forced himself to wait, to let her think. Finally, she reached up and touched his face, her hand gentle against his scarred cheek. "It is more than enough," she said softly. "Yes, Thomas. Yes, I will marry you." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling her heart beating against his chest. "I will carry you forever," he murmured into her hair. "Through whatever comes, you will never have to face anything alone again." "I know," Natty said, her arms tight around him. "I have known that since the moment you picked me up out of the snow." The next morning, they set out for Quartz Hill together, Thomas driving a borrowed horse and small wagon he kept in a lean-to behind the cabin. The journey that had nearly killed Natty alone was manageable with proper supplies and transportation, and they reached the town 3 days later, arriving just as the sun was setting. Quartz Hill was a rough mining town, hastily built and constantly expanding as prospectors flooded the area hoping to strike it rich. The main street was a muddy thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings of varying quality, from the sturdy bank and general store to rickety saloons and gambling dens that looked like they might blow over in a strong wind. The population was predominantly male, and Natty drew curious and sometimes leering looks as Thomas helped her down from the wagon. "Stay close to me," Thomas said quietly, his hand resting protectively on her back as they made their way down the street. "This is not the kind of town where a woman wants to be alone." They found the small church at the end of the main street, a modest building with a simple cross above the door. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Carlyle who looked to be in his 50s, answered their knock and listened as Thomas explained their situation. He agreed to marry them the next morning, though he looked somewhat disapproving of their haste. "I prefer couples to wait, give themselves time to be certain," he said. "But I suppose in circumstances like yours, waiting is not practical." That night, they stayed in separate rooms at the town's only respectable boarding house, run by a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Patterson. Natty used the time to ask around about her aunt, and to Thomas's relief, they learned that Martha Zimmerman was indeed still in town, running a small laundry business out of her home on the edge of the settlement. They visited her the next morning before the wedding, and the reunion between aunt and niece was tearful and joyous. Martha was a round, cheerful woman in her 50s who immediately swept Natty into a crushing embrace and scolded her for making such a dangerous journey alone. "Though I am glad you did, or you never would have met your young man here," Martha said, beaming at Thomas. "He seems like a good sort, and Lord knows you deserve some happiness after everything you have been through." Martha insisted on attending the wedding and providing Natty with a proper dress for the occasion, a simple but pretty blue gown that had belonged to her late daughter. With Martha and Mrs. Patterson as witnesses, Thomas and Natty were married in the small church, exchanging vows in steady voices while Reverend Carlyle presided over the brief ceremony. When Thomas kissed his new wife, he felt a sense of rightness that went bone deep. This woman, who had stumbled into his life half frozen and desperate, was now his partner, his family, his future. He held her hand tightly as they signed the marriage certificate, unwilling to let her go even for a moment. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, finally together in every sense of the word. Thomas was gentle with Natty, mindful that this was new territory for both of them, and was awed by the trust she showed him, the way she gave herself completely without reservation. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, talking in whispers about their plans for the future. "I want to expand the cabin," Thomas said, running his fingers through her long hair. "Add another room, maybe two. I want us to have a real home, not just a rough shack in the woods." "I like your rough shack," Natty said, tilting her head to smile at him. "But I will not complain about more space, especially if we are going to fill it with children someday." "You want children?" Thomas asked, pleased by the thought. "Eventually, yes," Natty said. "Not right away. I want time to just be us first, but someday I would like to have a family again." "Would you? With you?" "Yes," Thomas said, kissing her forehead. "I would like that very much." They returned to the cabin a few days later, stopping at the general store in Quartz Hill to stock up on supplies. Thomas had some money saved from trapping, and with careful management, they would be fine until spring when he could take his pelts to market. Martha had given them several gifts, including a set of dishes, some good blankets, and a beautiful quilt she had made herself. As they approached the cabin in the late afternoon, Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to Natty. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reid," he said, loving the way her name sounded with his attached to it. Natty looked at the small log structure, so different from any home she had known before, and smiled. "Home," she repeated as though testing the word. "Yes, I like the sound of that." Thomas lifted her from the wagon, carrying her despite her laughing protests. "Thomas, put me down, I can walk." "I told you I would carry you forever," he said, pushing the cabin door open with his shoulder. "I meant it. Besides, it is tradition to carry your bride over the threshold." He set her down gently once they were inside, and they spent the rest of the evening unpacking their supplies and arranging their new belongings. The cabin already felt different, more like a true home than it ever had when Thomas lived there alone. Natty's presence brought warmth and life to the space, making it feel less like a simple shelter and more like a place where a future could be built. As winter gradually gave way to early spring, Thomas and Natty settled into married life with surprising ease. They had their adjustments, of course, learning each other's habits and preferences, navigating the occasional disagreement. But the fundamental compatibility they had discovered during those first weeks together only deepened as time went on. Thomas kept his promise about expanding the cabin, starting work on an addition as soon as the weather allowed. He was a skilled carpenter, having learned the trade from his father before turning to cattle driving, and he took great satisfaction in building something permanent for his wife. Natty helped when she could, holding boards steady and passing him tools, but mostly she focused on establishing a garden plot for vegetables and herbs, determined to make them as self-sufficient as possible. In late April, they received an unexpected visitor. A young man rode up to the cabin one afternoon, calling out a greeting before dismounting. Thomas came out to meet him, hand near his rifle until he got a better sense of the stranger's intentions. "Name is Jacob Sullivan," the young man said, holding his hands where Thomas could see them. "I am looking for land to homestead, and somebody in Quartz Hill mentioned you might know this area well." Thomas relaxed slightly. "I know it well enough. What kind of land are you looking for?" Over the next hour, Jacob explained that he was recently married himself and hoping to file a homestead claim somewhere in the area. He was 23, earnest, and clearly green when it came to surviving in the wilderness, but Thomas found himself liking the young man's determination. "There is a good stretch of land about 5 miles east of here," Thomas said finally. "Near a creek, good timber, flat enough for farming. Nobody has claimed it yet, far as I know." Jacob's face lit up. "Would you be willing to show me? I would pay you for your time." "No payment necessary," Thomas said. "Come back tomorrow morning and I will take you out there." Over the following months, Thomas and Jacob developed an unexpected friendship. Jacob took the homestead Thomas had shown him, and he and his wife Clara became the Reeds' nearest neighbors. The two couples helped each other with various projects, sharing resources and knowledge, and Natty was particularly grateful to have another woman nearby for companionship. Clara was 20 years old, practical and hardworking, and she and Natty bonded quickly over shared experiences of being young wives trying to build lives in an unforgiving landscape. They visited back and forth regularly, teaching each other skills and simply enjoying female conversation. As summer arrived, Thomas's trap lines remained profitable, and he was able to trade pelts and fresh meat in Quartz Hill for supplies and a few luxuries. He bought Natty a proper stove to replace the temperamental one they had been using, and her face when he installed it made every penny spent worthwhile. "Thomas Reed, you are spoiling me," she said, examining the new stove with obvious delight. "You deserve to be spoiled," he replied, pulling her into his arms. "Besides, this way I get better meals. Everybody wins." She swatted his chest playfully. "Oh, so it is just about the food." "Absolutely," he said with a straight face, then laughed when she tried to pull away. "No, wait, I was joking. Come back here." Their first summer together was marked by hard work but also deep contentment. They established routines, learned to read each other's moods, and built the kind of partnership that made daily life easier for both of them. Thomas taught Natty to shoot and to ride properly, skills she took to with her characteristic determination. Natty taught Thomas to read beyond the basic level he had achieved as a child, and they spent many evenings with her reading aloud from the few books they owned, his head in her lap as her voice wove stories that transported them far from their small cabin. In September, Natty told Thomas she was pregnant. She had suspected for several weeks but had waited until she was certain before saying anything. Thomas's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her off her feet, spinning her around before remembering himself and setting her down carefully as though she might break. "Are you happy?" she asked, searching his face. "Happy," Thomas repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Natty, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and amazed all at once. We are going to have a baby. A family." "We already are a family," Natty pointed out, but she was grinning. "A bigger family then," Thomas amended. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "When? Early spring, I think. March or April." Thomas immediately began making plans, adding insulation to the cabin, building a proper cradle, ensuring they had sufficient supplies laid in for the winter when travel would be difficult and Natty would be less mobile. He fretted constantly about her health, which Natty found both touching and occasionally exasperating. "I am pregnant, not dying," she reminded him one evening when he insisted she sit down rather than help him carry in firewood. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," Thomas said stubbornly, "and not my baby. Let me fuss, it makes me feel useful." Natty softened, reaching up to touch his face. "All right, you can fuss, but within reason." Their second winter together was vastly different from their first. Instead of two near strangers learning to coexist, they were husband and wife preparing for their first child, planning and dreaming about the future. They decided that if the baby was a boy, they would name him William after Thomas's father. If a girl, Sarah after Natty's mother. As Natty's pregnancy advanced, Thomas found himself marveling at the changes in her body, the visible proof of the life they had created together. He would lie with his head against her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick and move, awed by the miracle of it. Natty would laugh at his expression of wonder, running her fingers through his hair. "You are going to be a good father," she told him one night. "How do you know?" Thomas asked, genuine concern in his voice. "I have never done this before. What if I am terrible at it?" "You will not be terrible at it," Natty said confidently. "You are patient and kind and strong. You will teach our child everything they need to know about surviving and thriving out here. And more importantly, you will love them. That is what matters most." In late March, Natty went into labor. Thomas had arranged for Clara to come stay with them as Natty's due date approached, and he was profoundly grateful for her presence when the contractions began. Clara had assisted at several births and knew what to do, while Thomas felt utterly useless and terrified. "Boil water and gather clean linens," Clara instructed him. "And try to stay calm. Natty needs you to be strong right now." Thomas did as he was told, but listening to his wife's cries of pain was the hardest thing he had ever endured. He held her hand when she needed him, wiped her face with cool cloths, and tried to be reassuring even though he was scared out of his mind. After 12 hours of labor, their son was born, squalling and red-faced and perfect. Clara cleaned him up and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Natty's arms. Thomas sat beside the bed, staring at his wife and child with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "William," Natty said softly, touching the baby's tiny hand. "William Thomas Reed, what do you think?" "I think he is beautiful," Thomas said hoarsely. "And I think you are the strongest person I have ever known. I love you, Natty, more than I can possibly say." "I love you too," Natty said, exhausted but radiant. "We did it, Thomas. We made a family." The first months of parenthood were challenging in ways neither of them had anticipated. William was a fussy baby, prone to colic and long bouts of crying that left both parents exhausted and frazzled. But he was also their son, and they loved him with a fierce intensity that surprised them both. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, taking his turn walking the floor with William at night, changing diapers without complaint, and helping however he could. He would sit for hours with his son on his chest, talking to him about everything and nothing, telling him about the world he would grow up in. As William grew from infant to toddler, the cabin rang with his laughter and occasional tantrums. He was a curious child, constantly getting into things he should not, and keeping him safe required constant vigilance. But he brought such joy to their lives that neither Thomas nor Natty could imagine their existence without him. When William was 2 years old, Natty announced she was pregnant again. Thomas was delighted but also apprehensive, remembering how difficult her first labor had been. This pregnancy was easier, though, and when their second child arrived in late fall, it was a daughter with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray-green eyes. They named her Sarah. And if Thomas had been protective of Natty, he was doubly so with his tiny daughter. He held her constantly, gazing at her with such open adoration that Natty teased him about being wrapped around her finger already. "Just wait until she is older and starts batting those eyelashes at you," Natty said, laughing at his expression. "You will give her anything she wants." "Probably," Thomas admitted without shame. "But that is years away. Right now, she is just my perfect little girl." Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. The cabin had grown considerably over the years, now boasting 2 additional rooms and a proper loft space. Thomas had also built a small barn for their horse and chickens, and Natty's garden had expanded into a substantial plot that provided much of their food during the growing season. They had become established members of the small community forming in the area around Quartz Hill. More homesteaders had arrived, drawn by cheap land and opportunity, and a sense of neighborliness developed among the scattered families. They held occasional gatherings, celebrating holidays and harvests together, and the children played while the adults shared news and gossip. Thomas had transitioned from trapping to a combination of ranching and odd jobs, having acquired several head of cattle through various trades and careful saving. It was not a large operation, but it was growing, and he took pride in building something that could be passed down to his children. Natty had become known in the area for her skills with herbs and healing, knowledge she had accumulated through a combination of books, advice from older women, and simple trial and error. People would come to her with various ailments, and she helped when she could, accepting payment in goods or labor rather than cash, which was always scarce. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Natty with a gift he had been working on for months. He led her outside after dinner, William and Sarah playing nearby under the watchful eye of Clara, who had come over for the occasion. "Close your eyes," Thomas instructed, taking her hand. "Thomas, what are you up to?" Natty asked, but she complied, letting him guide her across the yard. "All right, open them." Natty opened her eyes and gasped. Before her stood a beautifully crafted rocking chair, made from smooth wood and featuring intricate carvings of flowers and vines along the arms and back. "Thomas," she breathed, running her fingers over the detailed work. "Did you make this?" "I did," he said, looking pleased with her reaction. "I wanted you to have something special, something just for you. I know how you like to sit outside in the evenings and watch the sunset. Now you can do it in comfort." Natty threw her arms around his neck, kissing him soundly. "It is perfect. You are perfect. How did I get so lucky?" "I am the lucky one," Thomas said, holding her close. 5 years ago, I was alone in that cabin, convinced I would spend the rest of my life by myself. Then you stumbled into my world, half frozen and stubborn, and everything changed. You gave me a family, Natty. You gave me a reason to build instead of just survive. I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I will love you even more tomorrow." "That is quite a speech, Mr. Reed," Natty said, her eyes bright with tears. "But I have one too. 5 years ago, I thought my life was over. I had lost everything and everyone I cared about, and I was ready to die in that snow, but you picked me up. You carried me to safety and took care of me when you had no reason to. You gave me hope and a home and a family. You showed me what love is supposed to look like. I thank God every day that I collapsed in your field instead of somewhere else." They stood there holding each other as the sun set over the Montana landscape, their children playing nearby, the life they had built together spread out around them. It had not been easy, and there had been struggles and setbacks along the way. But they had faced everything together, just as Thomas had promised that first night when he said he would carry her forever. As the years continued to pass, the Reed family grew and prospered. When William was 5 and Sarah 3, Natty gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Jacob and Henry. The cabin was bursting at the seams, and Thomas finally gave in and built a proper house, a substantial 2-story structure that was the envy of their neighbors. The new house had 4 bedrooms upstairs, a large kitchen, a dining room, and a parlor. It even had glass windows, a luxury that had required careful saving and a special order from back east. Natty cried when she first walked through the completed structure, overwhelmed by how far they had come from that rough cabin where they had begun their life together. "We are keeping the cabin," Thomas said, putting his arm around her as they stood in their new parlor. "I thought we could use it for storage or maybe as a guest house, but I could not tear it down. Too many memories." "Good," Natty said, leaning against him. "That cabin saved my life. It is where we fell in love. It deserves to stand as long as it can." Their children grew strong and healthy, thriving in the Montana wilderness. William was serious and responsible like his father, taking naturally to ranch work as soon as he was old enough. Sarah was sweet, but with a stubborn streak that reminded Thomas of Natty, and she could ride a horse almost before she could walk. The twins were mischievous and adventurous, constantly getting into trouble but so charming that they rarely faced serious consequences. Thomas and Natty watched their children grow with wonder and no small amount of pride. They had done this, had built this family from nothing but determination and love. On difficult days, when money was tight or illness struck or the weather destroyed crops, they leaned on each other and found strength in their partnership. Martha, Natty's aunt, remained an important presence in their lives, visiting regularly and being adopted as grandmother by the Reed children. She eventually moved closer to them, tired of town life, and Thomas built her a small cottage on their property. Having her nearby was a blessing, especially as she got older and needed more care, and the children adored their great-aunt Martha with her endless stories and patient nature. Jacob and Clara Sullivan remained their closest friends, and their children grew up alongside the Reed children, more like cousins than neighbors. The two families helped each other through hard times and celebrated good times together, forming the kind of bonds that would last for generations. When William turned 10, Thomas began teaching him seriously about ranching and the responsibilities that would someday be his. He was careful not to push too hard, remembering his own youth and his need to make his own choices, but William seemed genuinely interested in the life his father was showing him. "You ever wish you could do something else?" Thomas asked his son one day as they mended fence together. "Go somewhere different, see more of the world." William considered the question seriously, as he did everything. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to see a real city or the ocean, but mostly I like it here. This is home. These are our mountains and our land. Why would I want to be anywhere else?" Thomas felt a swell of satisfaction at the answer, even as he made sure William knew he would support whatever path his son eventually chose. But it was gratifying to know that, at least for now, William loved this life as much as Thomas had come to. Sarah, on the other hand, frequently declared she wanted to be a doctor, having been fascinated by her mother's healing work. Natty encouraged this ambition, even though they both knew the challenges a woman would face in pursuing such a career. But times were changing slowly, and Natty refused to tell her daughter she could not achieve her dreams. The twins were still young enough that their ambitions changed weekly, from cowboys to railroad engineers to explorers. Thomas and Natty just smiled and encouraged them all, knowing that whatever their children decided to do, they would support them. On a crisp autumn evening when they had been married for 12 years, Thomas and Natty sat together on the porch of their house, watching their children play in the yard. Martha was in her cottage, and the smell of Natty's venison stew drifted from the kitchen where it was staying warm for supper. "I have been thinking," Natty said, laced through Thomas's as they rocked gently in the matching chairs he had built, "about that day you found me in the snow." "I think about it often," Thomas admitted. "How close I came to losing you before I ever had you. If I had been inside instead of out by the fire, if I had looked the other direction, if you had fallen just a little further away where I could not see you." "But none of those things happened," Natty said firmly. "You were exactly where you needed to be, and so was I. I used to think it was just luck or chance, but now I believe it was meant to be. We were meant to find each other, Thomas. We were meant to build this life together." "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "The life you might have had if things had been different, if your father had not died, if you had not had to leave Fort Benton." "Never," Natty said without hesitation. "I loved my father, and I wish he could have lived to see his grandchildren. But if things had been different, I would not have you, would not have them. This life, right here, is everything I could ever want." Thomas pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head. "Do you remember what I said to you that day, when I picked you up?" "You said you would carry me forever," Natty replied softly. "I meant it then, and I mean it now," Thomas said. "Through everything, good and bad, I will always be here to carry you when you need it. You are my partner, my love, my everything." "And you are mine," Natty said, tilting her face up to kiss him. "Forever and always." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas and Natty sat together surrounded by the life they had built, the family they had created, and the love that had sustained them through everything. The journey from that desperate winter day to this moment of contentment had been long and sometimes difficult, but neither would have changed a single step of it. Their story was one repeated countless times across the frontier, of people finding each other against long odds, of building something from nothing through sheer determination and partnership. But to them, it was unique and precious, a testament to the power of love to transform even the darkest moments into the foundation for something beautiful. The years continued to pass, marked by the usual joys and sorrows of life. Thomas's hair began to gray at the temples, and Natty found lines forming around her eyes from years of squinting in the bright Montana sun. But they wore these changes with pride, badges of a life fully lived. William grew into a fine young man, eventually marrying a schoolteacher from Quartz Hill and starting his own family on a portion of the Reed land. Sarah did indeed pursue her dream of becoming a doctor, heading east for medical school at 18 and returning 5 years later as doctor. Sarah Reed, one of the few female physicians in Montana. She set up practice in Quartz Hill, which had grown into a proper town, and became known throughout the territory for her skill and compassion. The twins, Jacob and Henry, went into business together, starting a freight company that transported goods between Montana and the surrounding territories. They were successful and restless, always moving, but they came home regularly to the ranch that would always be the center of their world. Thomas and Natty became grandparents multiple times over, their house once again filled with the sounds of children. They delighted in spoiling their grandchildren in ways they had never been able to spoil their own children, and watching their family expand and thrive was a source of constant joy. Martha lived to be 78, passing peacefully in her sleep with Natty at her side. Her loss was deeply felt by the entire family, but they took comfort in knowing she had spent her final years surrounded by love. They buried her on a hillside overlooking the ranch, where wildflowers bloomed every spring. As Thomas approached his 50th birthday, he began to slow down, not as able to do the heavy physical labor that had been routine in his youth. He was smart enough to accept this gracefully, letting William and his sons-in-law take over more of the ranch operations, while he focused on the aspects of the business he could still handle. One winter evening, Thomas and Natty sat by the fireplace in their parlor, alone for once with all the children and grandchildren off at their own homes. Snow fell softly outside, and the fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "We should do this more often," Natty said, cuddled against Thomas's side on the sofa he had built years ago. "Have quiet evenings, just the two of us. I love our family, but sometimes I miss when it was just us in that little cabin." "We still have that cabin," Thomas pointed out. "We could spend a night there if you want. Relive our early days," Natty laughed. "I am not sure my old bones could handle sleeping on that bed anymore, but it is a nice thought." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind outside and the fire inside. Then Thomas said, "Natty, do you remember what today is?" "Wednesday," Natty guessed, looking confused. "It is the anniversary of the day I found you," Thomas said. 25 years ago today, you collapsed in the snow 50 yards from my cabin, and I carried you inside. A quarter-century ago, our life together began." Natty sat up, her eyes wide. "I cannot believe I forgot. Thomas, I am sorry. We should be celebrating." "We are celebrating," Thomas said, pulling her back against him. "Right now, like this. 25 years, Natty. 25 years of waking up next to you, of building a life with you, of loving you more with each passing day. When I carried you into that cabin, I had no idea what I was starting. I just knew I could not let you die. And that single decision changed everything." "You saved my life that day," Natty said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you have saved it every day since then too, with your love, your support, your partnership. I am who I am because of you, Thomas. The life we have built together is beyond anything I could have dreamed of in my darkest moments." "We built it together," Thomas corrected gently. "Every bit of it. I may have carried you that first day, but you have carried me just as often over the years. When I doubted myself, when things were hard, when I did not think I could go on, you were there. We carry each other, Natty. That is what makes us work." "I love you," Natty said simply. "More than words can express. Thank you for picking me up out of that snow. Thank you for every single day since then. Thank you for falling in my field instead of someone else's," Thomas replied, smiling. "Best thing that ever happened to me." As they sat together watching the fire burn down to embers, both reflected on the incredible journey they had shared. From strangers to spouses, from a tiny cabin to a thriving ranch, from just the two of them to a family spanning 3 generations. Every struggle, every triumph, every ordinary moment in between had led them here, to this place of contentment and enduring love. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the Montana landscape in white just as it had 25 years earlier. But inside, Thomas and Natty Reed were warm and safe, surrounded by the life they had built and the love that had sustained them through everything. And they knew, with absolute certainty, that they would face whatever remaining years they had together, carrying each other through joy and sorrow alike, just as they always had. The story of their love would be told to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passed down through generations, as an example of what two people could build when they committed fully to each other, and to the life they were creating. It was a story unique to them, but also universal, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love. As Thomas held Natty close in the firelight, he thought back to that cold winter day when a half-frozen stranger had stumbled into his world. He thought about the impulse that had made him run to her, the decision to bring her into his home, the moment when he realized he could not let her leave. Every choice, every moment, had led them here. "I would do it all again," he murmured into Natty's hair. "Every single moment, exactly the same way." "So would I," Natty replied, settling more comfortably against him. "Every hardship, every challenge, every beautiful moment, all of it, with you, always with you." They stayed there by the fire until it burned down completely, reluctant to move, savoring this moment of peace and connection. Eventually, they made their way upstairs to the bedroom they had shared for so many years, comfortable and familiar in each other's presence. As Thomas drifted off to sleep with Natty in his arms, he felt profound gratitude for the life they had been given, the family they had created, and the love that had made it all possible. He had carried her that first day, weak from her winter journey, and had promised to carry her forever. It was a promise he had kept, and would continue to keep for as long as breath remained in his body. And Natty, falling asleep against her husband's steady heartbeat, thanked whatever force had guided her footsteps to his field that frozen day so long ago. She had been dying, alone and desperate with nothing left to live for. Thomas had given her everything: life, love, family, purpose. He had carried her out of darkness into light, and she had spent every day since trying to give him the same gift. Their love story, born in desperation and hardship, had bloomed into something rare and beautiful. It would endure beyond their own lives, living on in their children and grandchildren, in the land they had tended, in the community they had helped build. Two people, brought together by chance or fate, who had chosen each other every day and built a legacy that would last for generations. As the Montana night deepened around their house, Thomas and Natty Reed slept peacefully, surrounded by evidence of their shared life, secure in their love for each other and the family they had created. The winter wind might howl outside, but they were warm and safe together, just as they had been since that first night 25 years ago when a cowboy had lifted a dying woman from the snow and promised to carry her forever. And he had kept that promise through 25 years and beyond, through every season and every challenge. He had carried her and she had carried him, and together they had built something that would endure long after they were gone. Their story was complete, a circle closed, a promise fulfilled. They had found each other in the darkness and had spent their lives creating light. And that light would continue to shine, warming future generations, a testament to the power of two people who loved each other enough to build a world together. The end of their story was not sad but triumphant, not an ending but a culmination. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and created a legacy of family and community that would outlast them both. And when their final day came, many years in the future, they would face it together as they had faced everything else, holding hands and grateful for every moment they had been given. But that day was still far off. For now they had more mornings to wake up together, more sunsets to watch from their porch, more grandchildren to spoil, more quiet evenings by the fire. They had earned these peaceful years, had fought for them through hard work and dedication, and unwavering commitment to each other. As the story of Thomas and Natty Reed came to its close, it was not with a period but with an ellipsis, acknowledging that while their specific tale was ending, the impact of their lives continued. Their children carried forward their values, their grandchildren bore their names, their land continued to produce and provide. The cabin where it all began still stood, a monument to the day when love had literally saved a life. And sometimes, on quiet winter evenings, their descendants would gather around fires and tell the story of how it all began. How great-grandmother Natty had been weak from a winter journey, how great-grandfather Thomas had lifted her up and promised to carry her forever, and how that promise had become the foundation for generations of love, family, and prosperity. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the years, because in the end, that is what endures. Love that transcends hardship, commitment that weathers all storms, and the willingness to carry each other through whatever life brings. Thomas and Natty Reed had embodied these principles, and their story stood as proof that even in the harshest circumstances, love could not only survive but thrive, creating something beautiful and lasting from the most unlikely beginnings. Their legacy lived on in every sunset over the Montana mountains, in every child born to their descendants, in every act of kindness and courage performed by those who carried their blood. The cowboy who had saved a dying woman's life had gained far more than he could have imagined. And the woman who had collapsed in the snow, certain her story was over, had instead found that it was just beginning. Together, they had written a love story for the ages, simple in its telling but profound in its impact. A story of survival and love, of hardship and triumph, of two people who found each other against all odds and built a life that mattered. And that story, complete and beautiful in all its imperfection, would continue to inspire long after its main characters had passed into legend. A reminder that love, real and true and committed, could indeed carry you forever.